It's my absolute pleasure to welcome our speaker tonight, Professor Michael Dougan, who we're welcoming actually back to Cambridge. And I can't believe it's been 4 years since we last had you in Cambridge, although this time it's only virtually, I'm afraid. And I think, a lot has changed in that 4 years, and not all of it for the better. But I think looking back on it, I think Michael identified, one of the key things that he identified was the key importance of Northern Ireland in the whole Brexit and how Brexit would evolve. And I think he's been absolutely, that what's happened in the last 4 years has actually borne that. And obviously, as we've been seeing in the news recently, it is still a key issue and quite a perhaps a dangerous issue at the moment. Michael, as though he's no stranger to Cambridge, he actually graduated from Cambridge, having studied law, and then he's now the professor Professor European Law at Liverpool, at the University of Liverpool, and also the Jean Monnet Chair in EU Law. And he's become one of the most well-respected and forthright public commentators on Brexit and its consequences. And he's actually got a new book just out in the last months, published by Oxford University Press, called The UK's Withdrawal from the EU, A Legal Analysis. And with that, I'll just hand over to Michael Dougan.
Super. Thanks very much, Paul. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine, thanks.
Perfect, lovely. Thanks very much indeed. And thanks very much, of course, for the invitation to speak again to Cambridge for Europe. It's always lovely to be back. In fact, I lived in Cambridge for 10 years altogether, between various degrees and jobs and stuff like that. And they were a very happy 10 years indeed. So it's really nice memories to come back to. As Paul said, I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes about developments since the end of the transition period, which expired about 10 months ago or so. And I'm going to do that along three main axes. First of all, the sort of broad framework for EU-UK relations, which is now provided for under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the gigantic treaty that was signed not that long ago. Secondly, the more specific framework for EU-UK relations, which is applicable to Northern Ireland under the Withdrawal Agreement and its dedicated and now infamous border protocol. And thirdly, the more internal dynamics of the UK itself as the regime of Boris Johnson continues to reshape the country according to its own political agenda. Now, along each of those three axes, although they deal with quite different and very diverse issues, the basic tactic we see at work is effectively identical. Of course, the Johnson regime is systematically setting out to undermine formal institutions and processes, not only those that characterized EU-UK relations for 50 years, also the new framework that was agreed between the two parties in an effort to insulate the peace process in Northern Ireland from the very worst effects of Brexit, and probably most importantly at the moment, those that underpin the UK's long-standing, yet actually relatively fragile domestic system of liberal democracy. But at the same time, the Tory Trumpists, and that's what they are, they're Trumpists in a different country, they've also set about systematically undermining the broader political and social and cultural values that actually give these legal frameworks and institutions and processes their underlying strength, their stability, their civility. Legal structures, I suppose, express but also support certain civilizational ideals. And if you really do want to throw a society into turmoil and rebuild it according to a different set of values, then yes, of course, you undermine its legal structures, but that's only one part of the overall plan. And that's exactly what the Johnson government is up to. So let's start off with our first axis, the broad framework of EU-UK relations as they've evolved since the end of the post-withdrawal transition period. Now here, it's important to go back and remember that the core of the UK's decision to leave the EU involved a basic choice between two main options. And we all know this, but we have to recall it, of course, so as we can follow what comes next. Either the UK could opt for a relatively close relationship with the EU, and the idea would be to minimize disruption in trade and the economy and society, and also make the border situation in Northern Ireland much easier to manage. But that would mean continued alignment of at least some, if not many, of the EU's regulatory standards and strategic choices. So this type of soft Brexit was always going to be less destructive, but the main price would be that the UK had effectively surrendered its leadership in Europe and its influence in Europe and through Europe and the wider world. The alternative, of course, the UK could opt for a relatively abrupt severance of its relations with the EU. That would tally, at least at a superficial level, with the Leave campaign's rhetoric about taking back control, even if only the most dim-witted of fools would ever seriously believe the propaganda about global Britain, sort of assuming its rightful place as a strategically autonomous power right at the fulcrum of world affairs, total fantasy, island stuff. But any such hard Brexit, would mean unprecedented disruption to the UK's economy and therefore to its wider society. And it would also make the border situation in Northern Ireland far more difficult to resolve. Now, we know that Theresa May, for all her faults, and there were many, opted in the end for a relatively soft Brexit, not entirely, not unambiguously, but in substance, a relatively soft Brexit. And we assume that she did so precisely because she recognized that it simply wasn't in the UK's national interest to embark upon a deliberate program of serious economic self-harm, and also because she seems to have genuinely grasped and feared the implications for Northern Ireland in particular. When Johnson and his cabal succeeded in ousting May and installing themselves in power, of course, they recalculated that basic equation. There would be a hard Brexit. In fact, there must be a hard Brexit, whatever the costs. And they either simply didn't believe or just didn't care that would inevitably lead to serious economic and wider social problems for the UK. And by its very nature, it would undermine the conditions that support the frankly still fragile peace process in Northern Ireland. Now, in that regard, all of the expert predictions have been proven entirely correct. There's no joy in saying that, huh? Well, many of us like the feeling that we were proved right all along, but there's no joy in saying this because the situation is totally devoid of any joy whatsoever. The regime got its hard Brexit. It is causing serious economic and wider social problems. It has undermined political stability in Northern Ireland in really quite fundamental and deeply worrying ways. We know all these things. These are just established facts. Let's just say a few more words, though, about Johnson's fundamental calculation. Bearing in mind, of course, that mine is a legal perspective rather than an economic or a sociological one. Now, as for hard Brexit, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement delivers that in abundance. Huh? Yes, it's better that we have fewer tariffs to pay rather than lots of them. Yes, it's better that we have some cross-border cooperation on crime and terrorism rather than none at all. But fundamentally, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement is such a downgrading of EU-UK relations, either compared to 5 decades of membership or compared to any of the softer Brexits which were on offer from the EU, that for many sectors and actors, there may as well be no agreement here at all. And indeed, the Tories have delivered a Brexit which is so uncompromising in its rejection of the UK's previous relationship with the rest of Europe that it was once advocated only by the lunatic fringe of the lunatic fringe that made up the Leave movement. But just as important as the facts of hard Brexit, its basic legal structures under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the empirical effects it's producing for businesses and individuals, is the way that the Johnson regime is managing its own responsibility for the situation that the UK now finds itself in. And in that regard, the Brexit tactics haven't changed one iota since 2016. Remember, the basic toolkit of any post-truth populist, whether it's Orban or Trump, whether it's Bolsonaro or Johnson, is simple but effective. You tell great big fat lies, you sell magic bean fantasies, and then when reality stubbornly proves you wrong, you double down even harder and even further on those tactics. You deny any form of responsibility, you blame everything on your manufactured enemies, you find new scapegoats for your supporters to detest. And that's basically what's happened in the UK over the past 10 months. There are no difficulties. Everything that happens here is simply world-leadingly brilliant. And even if there are a few hiccups here and there, well, they're probably the result of the pandemic. Don't you realize the whole world is suffering exactly the same problems as the UK is? What could any reasonable, responsible government do? Though I suppose Brexit was always going to have a few teething problems. You can't make the omelette of global Britain without breaking a few lazy, complacent, inefficient economic eggs, after all. And in many respects, we've discovered that Britain's broken economic model, the economic model that the Tories presided over for most of the past lifetime of us, was actually created by EU immigrants who used their low-skilled queue jumping privileges to drive down wages and undermine productivity. But it's very important to stress, and this is the bit, by the way, that my friends and colleagues across Europe find the most hilarious. No one in the UK talks about Brexit anymore. We're all completely over it. It's never mentioned. We've totally moved on. And it's the bitter, nasty Europeans who are simply obsessed with the idea of punishing poor little Britain for declaring its independence from Brussels. This is Soviet-style propaganda. We get it almost every day, gleefully repeated and embellished by the right-wing media. Now, what's true for the core Leave project of delivering a hard Brexit is true also for one of the primary victims of Johnson's machinations, and that is, of course, Northern Ireland. And that brings us on to the second of my three main axes for tonight. Again, we all know the story so well that I only really need to recall the main plot lines. We all knew from the moment he took power that Northern Ireland was going to be collateral damage in Johnson's decision to pursue a hard Brexit. And it was inevitable that the main price that Northern Ireland would pay for that decision was the imposition of a trading border across the Irish Sea. And that would entail an extensive system of checks and controls and barriers and costs on the movement of goods, partly from Northern Ireland to Great Britain, but mostly from Great Britain into Northern Ireland. That's exactly what Johnson proposed and signed up to in his Great New Brexit deal as finalised in October 2019. Now, we always suspected that Johnson negotiated the protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland only with the most cynical of motivations, so that he could claim to get Brexit done, he could win the general election, and that he didn't actually care less about the effect of his Great New Brexit deal on Northern Ireland at all. Because the truth is that even if, and I stress that, even if the protocol were to work exactly as intended, it was always going to be problematic. There was no way in which this protocol was going to work and things were just going to be smooth and easy. Because yes, the protocol does provide a workable solution to the problem of letting Johnson have his hard Brexit whilst avoiding a physical border across the island of Ireland. But that doesn't change the fact that the protocol is a very complex settlement built on a whole series of compromises that requires each of the main participants and every key stakeholder to accept that they have to lose something. Everybody is both a winner and a loser under that protocol. But the idea is you lose something to serve the greater good of protecting Northern Ireland from the full effects of a disastrous Brexit. Now, on the EU side, the main compromise is that a key land frontier of the customs union and the single market would be monitored, policed and enforced, not by the authorities of a member state, but by the authorities of a third country, the UK. And frankly, the UK is a third country that has consistently proven itself to be unreliable, if not altogether untrustworthy. As for the UK itself, the main compromise agreed by Johnson is that there would be a trading border down the Irish Sea. Now, of course, there was always some form of trade border down the Irish Sea, even while the UK was a member state of the EU. That's not new in itself. And of course, one of the impacts of Brexit upon the UK, and we see that already, is to facilitate new trade barriers in general, not just between the UK and the EU or the rest of the world, but also within the UK itself, between England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. But there's no doubt that the trading arrangements contained in the protocol are of a significantly greater magnitude. But that was the price that Johnson was willing to pay to deliver his hard Brexit. Now, it's easy in a way to say that the problems were always inherent in the protocol. I suppose the key point is we've never actually seen the protocol working as it was intended, because before the ink was even dry on that treaty, Johnson has done everything, and we really do mean everything, that he possibly can to misrepresent, frustrate, and undermine his very own border settlement over Northern Ireland. Besides consistently lying in Parliament and in public about the nature and content of what Johnson had actually agreed, let's just remember that the UK began by seriously delaying publication of its detailed operational plans for the protocol, despite repeated calls from everybody else on earth to see what the UK actually planned to do. When the UK did finally publish those plans very late in the day, they were basically no more than an attempt to rewrite the protocol by stealth. We know last autumn came the blatant threat to use legislation simply to reject the terms of the withdrawal agreement, which had been approved and enacted by Parliament only months before. And then, of course, came the decision unilaterally to refuse to comply with a whole range of the UK's clear obligations under the protocol, which brings us, of course, to David Frost's most recent machinations with his completely cynical demands to simply scrap the protocol altogether and replace it with some unidentified flying object, and his rejection of the EU's latest reform proposals, even before they were published. And even now, we live under the constant threat that the UK will simply unilaterally suspend the entire border system and precipitate an open crisis in Northern Ireland and over Northern Ireland. Now, on one level, the behavior of the Johnson regime here looks almost incomprehensible. The EU and the UK spent years hammering out a workable deal. It wasn't perfect, but it was workable in order to safeguard the peace process in Northern Ireland, while allowing the rest of us in the UK to suffer the hard Brexit experiment that Johnson so badly dreamed of. It's bad enough, of course, that the Johnson regime has consciously set out to torpedo its own deal. But what makes the Tories' behavior even worse is the fact that they don't have any credible alternative. They are ripping up the only workable plan there is, and they have nothing to offer in its place. Far from it. In effect, Johnson has simply retreated to the infantile position that he occupied for much of the period before Brexit. We want a hard Brexit. We don't want to have a border across the island of Ireland, but we won't have a border down the Irish Sea either. We know those three things are not compatible with each other. One of them has to give. And yet all Johnson can say, even now, is, we want it all. Give it to us. Where are the magic technologies? Where are the magic facilitations? Why can't the Europeans just surrender control of their borders so the UK can have control of its? Now, on another level, however, the behavior of the Johnson regime is actually perfectly rational and in keeping with its wider tactics and antics. Johnson couldn't care less about Northern Ireland, just as, quite frankly, we know that Johnson couldn't care less about Cambridge or Liverpool or London or Edinburgh, or indeed any of the rest of us at all. But as for poor Northern Ireland in particular, the protocol effectively provides another source of raw material for the Brexitists to practice their post-truth populist toolkit. Lies and fantasies beget more lies and fantasies. New scapegoats are added to old enemies to take the blame for every failure. So suddenly now we're told, again on a virtually daily basis, that poor old Johnson was bullied and blackmailed into signing this awful protocol by this evil alliance between Remoaner traitor MPs in the House of Commons, that language has been revived, and devious foreigners in Brussels, Paris and Berlin. Who could blame valiant little Johnson for trying to escape the shackles of this awful protocol once he'd finally regained our liberty from tyranny? And yet the nasty foreigners don't give up so easily, They want us to follow this agreement, the one that we signed, to the letter, rather than just letting us ignore it willy-nilly in specific and limited ways. And don't you know, these are allegations Johnson has made in Parliament, in public, that the EU has been trying to use food shortages in Northern Ireland. By the way, my sister assures me when she came to visit that there aren't any. She was shocked by the empty supermarket shelves in England, but she wasn't complaining about empty supermarket shelves in Northern Ireland. Trying to starve Northern Ireland into submission with the threat of a food blockade. This is all part of the wider plot to isolate and punish the UK, these nasty, bitter foreigners. This is all incredibly predictable. It's all very tiresome. It's deeply insulting, It's deeply insulting and very frustrating. But the fact is, when it comes to both the wider EU-UK relationship under the framework of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement and the more specific EU-UK relationship that's provided for under the Protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland, there is a perfectly rational and coherent way to explain the behaviour of the Johnson regime. Brexit was sold as a project of national rejuvenation. This was a revolution that would have no downsides, only considerable upsides. And meanwhile, we were promised the EU itself was a failing organisation that would soon collapse under the weight of its own tyranny. Britain was leading the way, others would quickly follow. And instead, as we all know, Brexit is being revealed steadily and surely, and there's a lot more to come, as a project simply of national self-harm. It's a revolution, to be sure, but one that consists almost entirely of considerable downsides. And whatever the gains might be, and we're still waiting to hear what they actually are, it's very difficult to imagine that they're going to be capable of balancing, let alone positively justifying, the costs. And as for the EU itself, we know the UK's departure didn't trigger its imminent and inevitable collapse. The rest of Europe continues on its journey of mutual cooperation. The rest of Europe is trying to find common solutions to the problem of living together in a complicated and unstable world. Sometimes they succeed quite well, sometimes less so, but they keep on trying. It's just that now they're trying without us. So Brexit is not a triumph, and the EU is not a failure. The only strategy left for the Leave generals to vindicate their great project is to drive the deepest possible wedge that they can between the British and their fellow Europeans. Because the only way that Brexit can now be fabricated into any form of a success is in the minds which have been pumped full of nationalistic arrogance and poisoned by xenophobic resentment. That's the only measure of success left for Brexit, is division and arrogance and resentment. But let's move on then finally to our third axis, the impact of Brexit upon the internal functioning of the UK itself. Now, we know that for many of the dozier Leave activists, and there were many of them, Brexit really was an end in itself in their imagination. They were so consumed by hatred of the EU that they just wanted to get out. We've all heard it. I just want to get out. I want to get out. And they had no idea what would come next. They didn't even frankly care what would come next or what might actually happen as a result. But for many other Leave activists, I hesitate to use the word intelligent. Let's say cunning. I think cunning is a more accurate description than intelligent. Brexit was only ever a means to an end, the start of something bigger, something more long-term. And that was the implementation of their own grand plans for the UK, plans that they blamed the EU, rightly or wrongly, for either frustrating or preventing. So after 10 months of Brexit freedom, what have you learned about the Leave project of taking back control? Now, for myself, for many other lawyers, the focus of that answer probably lies upon the specific ways, constitutional and legal ways, that Brexit has changed the way that the UK operates, the processes, the institutions, the fundamental policies that make up the state. And in that regard, there's no denying that Brexit has produced a lot of changes. Of course it has. Now, some of those legal changes directly flow from Brexit in a general or systemic way. Here, one might think of the European Union Withdrawal Act of 2018 and its system of retained EU law, as we have to call it. Vast numbers of rights and obligations that were created during 5 decades of EU membership have either been kept or rejected, amended, changed, in many cases purely by ministerial fiat. Or we can think of the UK Internal Market Act of 2020 and its novel regime of market access principles between England, Scotland, Wales, and to a degree Northern Ireland, which have a very significant effect on the reality of devolved powers within the constitutional settlement of the UK, thanks primarily driven by the UK government's antipathy towards local democracy, which disagrees with Tory policy. Certain other domestic changes also attributable to Brexit are maybe more sectoral and substantive in character rather than systemic in general, often necessitated by the fact that outside the EU and in the absence of any responsible planning in the run-up to the 2016 referendum itself, the UK was suddenly confronted with the need to create entirely new regulatory systems of its own to govern entire fields of its economy and society. Customs, trade, agriculture, fisheries, money laundering, nuclear safety, immigration, all of these things have had to be reinvented on the hoof at short notice in the run-up to the expiry of the transition period. And of course, there are various Brexit impacts that are more indirect in nature and more long-term in effect. We know, for example, that the very act of leaving the EU is likely to weaken the ability of the UK courts to control the unlawful exercise of state power, particularly by the central government. We know that the capacity of the UK to address various complex economic and social challenges now needs to be rebuilt, often in an entirely suboptimal manner, because many of the international networks for mutual cooperation and mutual assistance have been torn apart thanks to Brexit. in fields ranging from trade to anti-terrorism, from the environment to education. Now, we know all of those things, but what I'm going to do is, without suggesting for a moment that those aren't important, those are deadly important, the direct and systemic, the direct and sectoral, the indirect or long-term, they're all very important. And yet, perhaps the most worrying domestic developments to have occurred over the past 10 months are not so easily and clearly attributable to Brexit at all. And I'm talking here about the Johnson regime's really quite systematic attacks on the fundamental structures and values of liberal democracy in the UK. As before, the list of grievances and concerns will probably be familiar to any sentient and concerned individual living within this country. We see government plans to restrict even further the power of the courts to scrutinise and control the unlawful abuse of state power. We see attacks on our fundamental rights, the freedom to protest, and suggestions that the UK is going to reform its whole relationship also with the European Convention on Human Rights. We see proposals for electoral reform that are clearly intended to consolidate the existing regime's power at the expense of political opposition. We see regular governmental, but especially prime ministerial contempt for the constitutional position of Parliament as a forum, not only for making fundamental policy decisions, but also holding executive action and failures to account. And we see consistent attacks on the devolution settlements, not just under the UK Internal Market Act of 2020, but also, for example, the systematic undermining of the Sewell Convention. On one level, it's fair to say that none of those developments have any inherent link to Brexit, even to the sort of deeply damaging hard Brexit that the Tories have chosen to impose in our relations with the EU. Put simply, Brexit didn't have to end this way, at home, for us, as it's developing now. And indeed, many of these developments, let's be frank, could still have happened even if the UK had remained a full member state of the EU. The experience of countries like Hungary and Poland demonstrates that the slippery slope of a liberal authoritarianism is something even the EU really struggles to confront among its own member states. But on another level, even if there's no inherent link between Brexit and the Johnson regime's wider attack on liberal democracy in the UK, there is, of course, a very compelling connection between these two concurrent phenomena, because both developments, the Brexit project, as well as the UK's turn towards authoritarianism, are cut from the same populist cloth. They stem from the same determination of a political movement that's willing to use the most ruthless and cynical tactics in order precisely to undermine the institutions and values of liberal democracy. Because it isn't just the formal structures of UK democracy which are being undermined by the Johnson government. Once again, the Brexit Tories are also engaging in an attack on the underpinning political and social and cultural values that are meant to give expression and support to liberal democracy as a living, vibrant culture. We see the normalization, indeed the positive exaltation of blatant political dishonesty, ministers simply lying through their teeth and grinning about it. We see the refusal to accept, indeed even admit, any degree of responsibility for their own actions or failures, instead simply trying to shift blame onto all manner of enemies and scapegoats, however unconvincing it may be. And of course, probably the most unpleasant of the lot, trying to distract from the constant sense of mess and incompetence by whipping up false culture wars where they deliberately try to set different parts of society against each other in an incredibly destructive and divisive way. Both these developments, the Brexit project and the UK's turn towards authoritarianism, do clearly feed off each other in a mutual reinforcing manner. Yes, all of this could still have happened even if the UK had voted Remain in 2016. Yes, maybe we could have left the EU and managed to avoid this slide into liberalism, but neither of those hypothetical scenarios feels even anywhere near as instinctively likely as the actual real world that we're currently inhabiting. And it's a world in which the Johnson regime both has procured a deeply damaging hard Brexit, but is also setting about attacking the foundations of the UK as a liberal democracy. And these are not entirely separate and distinct initiatives. They are part of a single and closely intertwined political project. let's wrap up then. Very quick conclusions. The big worry is, where is this all going to end? Now, I'm naturally an optimist, believe it or not. I never sound like I am. I always sound like I'm a real catastrophist, but I'm actually quite a happy person. I'm a natural optimist. And I like to comfort myself in a way by foreseeing a world where the Johnson regime carries on wreaking havoc for another few years, but then against the odds, some form of progressive alliance emerges that manages to oust them from power. And it sets about both repairing relations with the rest of Europe and undertaking a major program of constitutional reform to protect UK democracy from future populist attacks. That's the world I'd like to see emerge. The problem is it's equally foreseeable that a different world happens, a world where the Johnson regime continues along its current trajectory of abusing state power so as to entrench its own partisan position, of using blatant populist tactics to cover its tracks, appealing and caring only about its core support base, and stirring up deep social divisions as a way to maintain the motivation of its almost quasi-fanatical activists. That trajectory then succeeds in delivering another term, and it's exactly the term that good old Donald Trump would have loved to have had in the US, because it would probably see the deaf rights of the UK as a functioning liberal democracy. The problem is that whichever of those worlds might finally occur, the happy world of a progressive alliance or the miserable world of another Johnson term, there's also another nightmarish possibility that Johnson is edging us towards. And that's one where the populist demons that Johnson has conjured up, actually, he can no longer control. He thinks he can because he's such an arrogant man that he believes he's just the master of the universe. But actually, these populist demons can very quickly devour their creator. And we might well end up, happy world or unhappy world, with a very significant part of the UK population who are so angry, so disillusioned, and so alienated that actually they begin to pose a permanent threat to political stability within the country. And that's not something the UK has experienced, certainly not in any of our lifetimes, possibly not for a very long time indeed. I don't want to live in that sort of world, and yet I'm constantly reminded of the ill-fated words, oh, it'll never happen here. And then it does. And then we think, oh, but surely someone is going to step in and stop this madness. Surely someone will step in and stop this madness. But there is nobody else, huh? Only us. And then by the time we actually do something about it, it's just too late. It's the story of fascism, whether you want to call it that, throughout the ages, or whether you want to call it something different. It's the story of fascism throughout the ages. And my only hope is we're not too late for us now to carry on doing something about it and to try and correct some of the mess which Johnson and his fanatical brigade have inflicted upon us. Anyway, I think I've spoken for more than 20 minutes. I promised I'd be brief, but thanks very much for your attention, and I look forward to some of the questions and discussion.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was fascinating. We don't mind at all if you go over a little bit. Just looking at the questions, actually, we start off with there's a question from Andra Makusha from the London Economic, who's got a question which I think several of us were probably thinking of, but he got there first, and which draws a few strands together of what you're saying, a few of your axes. And it's, hi, Michael, I'm a reporter for the London Economic. I was wondering what you think about the government's insistence to rewrite the Northern Ireland Protocol and also get rid of the Human Rights Act and the European Court. I presume that's the European Court of Justice. How do you see these from a legal perspective?
Okay, just give us one little second. I need to turn my heater off because it's probably for the first time in a long time. I'm going to say it's a bit too warm in here. Okay, what do I make of the government's plans to rewrite the protocol? I mean, I'll sort of reiterate a little what I said in the talk briefly, but then maybe say a few words, because I think the whole question of what comes next in Northern Ireland is obviously very pressing and very, very worrying. The government's plans to rewrite the protocol, as I sort of said in the talk, are rather lacking in realism. So what the government has basically said is, we want everything. We're not prepared to make compromises, and we just want everything. And we want to have our hard Brexit, We want to not have a border across the island of Ireland, and we don't want to have a border down the Irish Sea. And we want you, the EU, just to give that to us. Now, the problem is we've spent most of the past 5 years telling the UK government that it cannot have those things. It is objectively impossible to have those three things in the real world. And the question has been, which one of those things are you willing to sacrifice? Is it your hard Brexit? Is it peace in Ireland? Or is it unionist identity in Northern Ireland? Which of those three things do you care least about? The choice made by Johnson was, we care least about the unionists in Northern Ireland, despite all of our rhetoric and our brotherly love with the DUP. I don't think the DUP feels much brotherly love towards many people in the world. But you know, the brotherly love between the hard right of the Tories and the DUP, that doesn't matter. We're going to dump Northern Ireland, and we're going to have our hard Brexit and no border across the island of Ireland. And the solution will be the border down the Irish Sea. If they're not willing to have that anymore, then something else has to give. The real worry is what will come out of this whole set of, are they negotiations? I suppose they're a form of negotiation. The UK basically says that it's willing to effectively suspend the border provisions of the protocol and simply refuse to carry out the checks which it agreed to carry out on trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Now, that presents the EU with a really serious dilemma, because in that case, the single market, the customs union, are left territorially compromised. There will be a great big hole in the frontiers of Europe whereby goods can enter the EU, its customs union and its single market, unchecked and uncontrolled. That is simply not acceptable, huh? It is not acceptable. And yet the only other way to solve that is to start imposing checks and controls between Northern Ireland and the Republic. I forget about the lovely little Brexit fantasy. Well, actually, the Republic can leave the EU, or the Republic can leave the customs union, or the Republic can leave the single market. F off with your bloody fascism. The Republic is not going anywhere, huh? But that's the only real alternative that the EU has. And the problem is that you know, we talk about, you know, oh, there could be arbitration. In fact, under the withdrawal agreement, the Commission can still bring the UK to the Court of Justice and ask for the imposition of massive fines and judicial orders to fully comply with the protocol, because the protocol does preserve the jurisdiction of the Court of Justice in relation to the UK as regards implementation of the border provisions of the protocol. So we don't even need to rely on arbitration here. The Commission could rely on the Court of Justice itself to try and compel the UK to do this. The problem is, well, three problems. First of all, ultimately, if you're faced with a UK government that simply refuses to follow international law and respect its own word, there's not that much you can actually do about it. You can have as many court orders, as many fines, as many retaliations as you want. You can't actually force them to comply. Second problem is, of course, this actually feeds entirely into Johnson's core strategy. It whips up hatred against the foreigners who are punishing the poor UK, who are trying to belittle Britain and alienate it, who are trying to foster hostility towards Britain simply for trying to protect its own. You know, this actually feeds into the Johnson strategy directly. And the third problem is, of course, it ultimately doesn't solve the border problem either. Huh? It doesn't actually solve the problem that the border between Britain and Northern Ireland is open, and then the border between Northern Ireland and the whole single market and the customs union is open via the Republic. And that is not a sustainable situation. So I have to say, the EU, I think, finds itself in an incredibly difficult position here. And the EU's position is difficult for the main reason that it actually bloody cares about Northern Ireland. That's why the EU's position is difficult. The EU is in a difficult position because it actually wants to solve this problem, whereas the Johnson government's position is relatively strong because it literally couldn't give a bloody damn about what happens over there. And that's not an easy situation to find yourself in. And I don't envy the role of the EU in trying to deal with this with this situation, because it can't win. In a way, it can't win when you're faced with such cynical and dishonest people in such an incredibly difficult and complicated situation. I think the second part of your question was about the ECHR. I mean, I'm not an ECHR lawyer. I'm not a human rights lawyer in that way. So I'm not going to say very much about it because it really would be beyond my pay grade to do it. Suffice to say, I think you'll probably find that most of the human rights lawyers have been expecting this for a very long time. The only thing that matches the Tory hatred of the EU is the Tory hatred of the ECHR. And, you know, it's just another part of the same program, isn't it, of this aggressive nationalism that basically thinks we'll do it on our own and we don't need foreigners telling us what to do, which actually in the end simply serves to undermine yet further the idea of liberal democracy in which minority rights are protected, in which citizens actually have some form of effective shield against the abuse of state power, in which the institutions of the state have to respect certain basic principles which prevent them from infringing our very fundamental liberties. It's all part of the same story, I think, isn't it? So even though it's not my field and it's a totally separate legal system, I think it fits into the sort of overall narrative that we've been talking about.
Actually, I think with the ECHR, there's also the Northern Ireland dimension to that, where it is mentioned in the Good Friday Agreement as it's adherence to it is part of that. So I think it's, given the tensions already there, I think it's messing with the ECHR and the Human Rights Act is really poking a stick into a very nasty hornet's nest that's already buzzing quite loudly, I think.
And we should probably add as well, of course, that there is still a link back here to EU relations, because although the Trade and Cooperation Agreement as a whole doesn't make continued full UK compliance with the ECHR a condition for the entire existence of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the UK has signed up to certain commitments about respect for human rights in compliance with the ECHR. And the specific provisions of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement on cross-border criminal cooperation are even more explicitly tied to UK adherence to the ECHR. So it's not just about the UK and the ECHR itself, it's also about the UK's broader relationship with the EU, which is partly contingent upon the ECHR.
Thanks. We've got a question from Helen Munster. It's a more political angle. Is how do you think the impending victories for Sinn Féin in forthcoming elections in the north and the south of Ireland, so Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, will impact on the current English regime's monarchy? I suppose in Southern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, or Ireland, as I just call it, it's probably more likely to be a coalition rather than an outright government. But yeah. It's potentially there.
Yeah, potentially. It's a dead good question, and I'm afraid that's one that I really can't answer very much at all. I left Northern Ireland when I was 18, although I've now got a very much revived interest in its well-being and welfare, and of course I've always had, in the sense that I come from there, my family are there, I care very deeply about the place. I don't really follow the internal politics of Northern Ireland very closely. So maybe I'll instead of sort of directly addressing Helen's question, I'll just make a more general comment about the situation that Northern Ireland finds itself in. I mean, one of the ironies of the Good Friday Agreement is that one of its consequences was that the moderate parties in Northern Ireland were effectively destroyed, and the more extreme parties in Northern Ireland, or the more sort of community identity parties in Northern Ireland, were greatly strengthened. So the SDLP, the Ulster Unionists were almost wiped out at one stage. Sinn Féin and the DUP became much, much stronger. And that's still the situation, of course, that we find ourselves in. Maybe less so for the DUP, but be careful what you wish for. There are a lot weirder people in Northern Ireland than the DUP itself. One of the worries, I suppose, is that the protocol, and again, this comes back to what I said before, even if the protocol had worked well, the protocol was still deeply challenging for Northern Ireland. And I think it's deeply challenging on both sides. We know, and it was inevitable, that unionists and loyalists were going to find the system of border checks down the Irish Sea as difficult to square with their British identity. We knew that, and Johnson knew that. He just didn't bloody care. But equally, and I'm much more familiar with the sort of nationalist side than I am with the unionist side, I think the protocol also, and Brexit in general, but the protocol in particular, had a bit of a destabilizing impact also on the nationalist side, because suddenly talk about reunification came a generation earlier than anyone thought it really would. And people have started really genuinely, seriously talking about Irish reunification in a way that just wasn't thinkable before Brexit. It was on the back burner. It was something for a future generation to think about. It was not for the current generation to really aspire to anymore. It was a much more long-term ambition for nationalists and Republicans. So on both sides of the community divide in Northern Ireland, actually Brexit in general, the protocol in particular, has already had a destabilizing effect. Unionists feel greatly more threatened. Nationalists feel like suddenly the great prize is within their reach and it could happen in 5 or 10 years, not in 50 or 70. My big worry is that the whole situation is effectively fostering, reigniting identity politics in Northern Ireland, which are simply poisonous. But secondly, just taking away the incentive to make the Good Friday process work on both sides. And it's not just a DUP thing, it is also a nationalist and Sinn Féin thing, that people no longer feel fully incentivized to try and make the Northern Irish settlement work under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement. I think that damage has already been done to a degree. It's now being aggravated and worsened enormously by the behavior of the Johnson government, but I think that's damage which has already been done. Helen's question, I think, really just feeds into that. You know, the more that people go for the entrenched positions and the extremes, the more difficult the situation in Northern Ireland gets. If I were given any advice to Sinn Féin and the Republic, it would be, if you're going to start talking about reunification, you need to start actually planning for it and not just talking about it, because reunification will not be smooth, it will not be easy. When I was giving a talk in Italy last week, one of the Italian members of the audience said very perceptively, I wonder if in 10 years' time, we might end up with a reunited Ireland and then a 30-year civil war in the north. And that's precisely the danger that we're talking about through reunification. And so they've really got to start thinking and planning about it and not just playing the political rhetoric.
Actually, I just wonder on that point, because there is an aspect of the Northern Ireland Protocol that's quite a lot of businesses, from what I've read, I mean, as I say, I'm not an expert on it, but there's a lot of reports that quite a lot of businesses are welcoming aspects of the protocol and seeing opportunities, because it does put Northern Ireland in what it hasn't really had for last many decades, is kind of a unique economic position where it's got access to the GB market that nowhere else in the EU has. It's got access to the EU that nowhere else in the UK market has. And I just wonder if it is allowed to actually bed down and the Johnson government stops trying to undermine it and make it a fight, is there I just wonder if there's a possibility that once it's up and running and has the companies around the Northern Ireland society and the economy is adjusted to it, will there be a reluctance to change Northern Ireland's constitutional position in order, because you don't kill the goose that lays the golden eggs? I just wonder if, I think if you can get over this patch, maybe there's something quite hopeful in that.
Yeah, no, I completely. I think it's worth saying that the protocol is not necessarily working as awfully as it might have done if there hadn't been a trade and cooperation agreement between the UK. In a way, the situation in Northern Ireland would have been a lot more difficult if tariffs were fully applicable between EU and UK goods, because in that case, the whole set of provisions under the protocol about having to determine which goods are for the Northern Irish market and which goods might be at risk of entering the EU market would have been much more difficult, because you weren't just talking about sort of sausage meat and blah blah. Then you were talking about, we've got to collect taxes on these goods, and that becomes a much more burdensome and much more complicated affair. And the protocol provisions on those were actually a bit of a nightmare. The trade and cooperation agreement has sort of taken the blunt edge of that bit of the protocol, and so a lot of what's left is actually quite positive for Northern Ireland. I think it's fair to say that some of the difficulties that Northern Ireland has experienced in practice are again attributable to the Johnson government. They spent a good year telling businesses in Northern Ireland and in Scotland, England, and Wales, you don't need to bother changing your practices. You don't need to, bother rethinking your supply chains. You don't need to bother about any of the complications of this protocol because they just don't exist. And so I think a lot of the issues that Northern Ireland has experienced have been as businesses actually begin the processes of adjustment that they should have undertaken in advance of the protocol coming into effect, but the Johnson government actually positively dissuaded them from doing so. Let's face it, you can get sausages in the Republic if you really want them. They don't need to come from Manchester or Birmingham. Other people make sausages too. Having said all of that, of course, the long-term hope is that Northern Ireland occupies a sort of uniquely privileged position. But again, I don't think we should let that necessarily detract from the fact that the broader political and social implications of the protocol have been totally mismanaged. And what's the point of having a positive-looking economy if you've got a society which is on the verge of civil war with itself? Mind you, we could say that about most of the country these days, couldn't we?
Just looking for, I just actually, one of the things about the sausages was I believe Northern Ireland is quite a large net exporter of sausages. So I think there's certainly no shortage there. And
there are a couple of interesting kind of rule of law questions, I thought, if we wanted to get fascinating as Northern Ireland always is, if we wanted to move away slightly from that. Sergio Tavares had asked, against the backdrop of the current rule of law issues within the EU, how do you see the constitutional developments in the UK vis-a-vis Parliament and the judiciary? So it's kind of contextualising, I think, or looking for those links between rule of law issues on the continent and what's happening in this country.
Yeah. It's a dead good question from Sergio. I mean, at a macro level, it's a similar phenomenon, isn't it? Populist governments, populist right-wing governments in Hungary and Poland, seeking to do anything they can to undermine liberal democracy. Populist right-wing regime in the UK doing whatever it can to undermine liberal democracy. But of course, the contexts in which these various rule of law challenges are happening are completely different. And they're completely different for a couple of reasons. Really, the UK context is particularly dangerous, I think, precisely because of the constitutional setup of the UK. There's no written constitution. There were a few basic principles, of which the only one that really feels tangible most of the time is the sovereignty of Parliament. But given that we have a first-past-the-post system which hands virtually absolute constitutional power to any party that manages to win a general election, often with a share of the vote which is only a significant minority of the people who voted, let alone of the population as a whole, effectively we operate on the basis of minority governments which are handed absolute power over the country as a whole. That's not true in most other civilized places. Most other places have a written constitution, they have careful checks and balances, they do have ways of controlling governmental power. And of course, Hungary and Poland show that a determined populist government can hammer away at those checks and balances. Of course they do, but in the UK, it is infinitely easier for a populist government to basically shaft the whole country than it would be in many other contexts. And so in a way, the problems facing the UK are not, for example, about getting rid of independent judges and replacing them with political appointees. That's the main tactic, of the government in Poland. Clear out independent judges, replace them with political appointees who will do the government's bidding so that you effectively work around the constitution by simply neutering the rule of law in the hands of an independent judiciary. In the UK, it's much more straightforward. You just do things through parliamentary legislation that the judges can't question. And you restrict access to the court, so people find it incredibly difficult to get anywhere near a judge to challenge what you do. You don't need to clear out the UK judiciary and replace it with political appointments. You just neuter it and you just render its ability to question the government more ineffective. So in response to Sergio's question, the phenomenon is very similar, but the way that it's operationalized is inevitably quite difficult because of the different context of the UK. I have to say, my own solution to the problem of Hungary and Poland in the EU is a rather brutal one, and I've advocated it for quite a long time. Poland is a different story. As for Hungary, I would just chuck it out. I would chuck them out. Let Putin have his way with them and let them come back in 10 years' time and say, sorry, they got it all so horribly wrong. But the Hungarians, I think, have just crossed so many lines. And I don't really care that there's no legal power of expulsion from the EU. I would just say to them, we're going to give you 12 months, and then we don't want you back in our offices and we don't want you at our meetings. You're just out. You've crossed too many lines and you're actually an existential threat to our project for all of us, and we're not willing to put up with it anymore. Poland is a different story because I think it's fair to say that Poland, the government, is in a much more fragile position. Again, it relies on first past the posts and it has a fairly small majority. And I think Poland is a much different proposition, but I think Hungary has just crossed far too many lines and the EU has been far too tolerant of it. And maybe there comes a point when you just have to say, no, we're not willing to put up with this anymore. But anyway, I'm in a minority viewpoint on that among most EU lawyers.
Okay, thanks, Michael. I think we got a question from Barbara Davies. Had a few questions for Barbara Davies, but there is one about I'm trying to find it here now, about potential what we should do about the situation, what we can do as individuals, as organisations. And she was asking about, do you think it's possible that the Labour Party could agree to a progressive alliance standing down, where they say the Lib Dems could win a seat from the Tories, or would kind of more extreme members of the Labour Party prevent this? But maybe just discuss more generally what approach you think might work.
Yeah. In some respects, I think that's maybe a question that Paul and Michael would be better qualified to talk about than I am, because you're part of a major NGO that does an enormous amount of work. And I think maybe I'll sort of throw that question back to you, because we all do what we can, and the bit that I do what I can is by writing books and articles and giving talks and so on, but I'm not an activist in the sense of belonging to any particular organization or an ability in the place to sort of drive its activity. So I think it would be dead interesting to hear from Paul and Michael about what your organization does about it. As for Labour and a progressive alliance, well, wouldn't it be bloody wonderful, huh? Wouldn't it be bloody wonderful? The problem is that one of the lessons we've all learned in life is that the best ally of right-wing proto-fascists is dedicated left-wing socialists. Yeah, they're the best of allies in an unintended way, because it does seem that your average dedicated left-wing socialist seems to harbor a hatred for anybody who's slightly less left-wing than they are, which is far in excess of their determination to actually fight their real enemy, who you would assume to be the right-wing proto-fascists. I experience this myself on a fairly regular basis, where I am the devil incarnate, because I'm not quite left-wing enough for the revolutionary socialists to subscribe to. Yes, wouldn't it be bloody wonderful if the 60% of the population that doesn't vote Tory actually got their act together and formed a progressive alliance, and then, as I said, undertook the major program of constitutional reform that stops this type of disaster ever happening again. The problem is you need to convince a bunch of dedicated ideologues on the other side of the political spectrum that they need to show a bit of compromise and a bit of reality as well. And so far, I don't see much evidence of that happening.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's quite sobering, I think, with the idea of a progressive alliance, what we do now. And what I was talking to Michael beforehand and saying this, the problem about the situation is we're fighting it on just so many fronts, I think. There's a lot going on. There's some great work being done by the Good Law Project. I think I shared a link to them, and Barbara mentioned them as well in another comment, but they're very well worth supporting. They're doing excellent work and trying to hold the government to account on a whole range of issues. I mean, in general, I think we need to get out there again, and start showing the government, showing the media, showing the world that there are people who oppose what the government are doing. I think certainly Labour have been, for various reasons, but they've just been too quiet. And even when they are saying things, they're not getting picked up enough. And I think they need to really start challenging. And I think that's getting through. I think they are beginning to realise, you see quite a lot of country that they're realizing they can't just sit back and wait for the public opinion to turn. They got to try and start turning it. And that's what leadership, that's what real opposition is about. So maybe we'll start to see that again, I think, hopefully in the next coming months. But I say we're going into winter of Brexit discontent. And so it's maybe we'll see, we've already seen opinion is shifting against Brexit in various polls. So I think there is a change that we can possibly be part of, but unfortunately it's not damaging the government's polling that much. I mean, it's amazing when you think of what's happened over the last year. But so I think visibility, I think, will be something else. So we're going to try and start doing more events, starting with the stall in Cambridge this weekend. But the other thing I think is very important, is Michael mentioned it, is proportional representation, and getting Labour to commit to that, because I think even if there isn't a formal progressive alliance between the non-Tory parties, I think if Labour commit to introducing proportional representation, that won't only just, hopefully if they win, improve our democracy in future, but would make it easier for parties to do maybe even just informal alliances, maybe just not maybe standing down candidates, but not campaigning. We're not attacking each other, focusing their campaign efforts against the government rather than against each other, which is unfortunately something we see quite a lot of in Cambridge. So I think maybe that will be a key thing. So I think at the moment, anybody who's a union member, really kind of persuade your union reps, talk to them, get them to back proportional representation, get the union to back proportional representation, and get this done in time for the next election, general election, which may be, I've seen reports today in the news, and maybe as early as 2023. So it's not a huge amount of time to get our acts together. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I suspect at some point next year there'll be some sort of marches about democracy and accountability, because I think there's a whole range of things happening there which are deeply worrying. And it's even the march might be banned by then as well. So it's I think it's time to I mean, COVID's a problem, but I think we need to get out there. Anyway, I'll Michael, Clay,
yeah, can I add
questions there?
Well, can I just add a couple of things to that, just maybe addressing Michael D's question to us directly. I mean, just to note that Cambridge for Europe itself has members from a range of political parties. So, it is a successful cross-party movement. Perhaps the slight disappointment of recent months, well, perhaps / years actually, has been the absence of One Nation or more moderate conservative voices, which are not obviously around and would be quite nice to see. And my final point would just be to say, as personally a Labour Party member in Cambridge for Europe, it's occasionally frustrating to think that the Lib Dems think they're the only people here. There are plenty of us from Labour here too.
Fair points. And can I just sort of echo very much what Michael just said? It's the main thing I was scribbling down. I should say I'm not a member of any political party at all. I'm a sort of classic floating voter. I'll never vote Tory. I mean, I'd rather die than vote Tory. But I could vote Green, I could vote Lib Dem, I could vote Labour. You've probably heard me say this before. In my constituency, it really doesn't matter what I vote, because it votes 86% Labour as a minimum anyway. So really, I could vote for myself, and it wouldn't really matter. But I think probably one of the key points that needs to be get across about the situation the UK is currently in is that this is not about people on the centre right, people on the centre left, even people a bit more right, even people a bit more left. This is basically about people who want the UK to be a liberal democracy and people who don't. And it doesn't really matter where you stand on the reasonable spectrum of political preferences. This is about whether you want the UK to stay as a liberal democracy or whether you want it sliding into something much darker and much more dangerous. And from that point of view, one of the big challenges I think many of us have is precisely to win over the disillusioned One Nation Tories who are effectively homeless. Johnson did a very good job of totally decapitating them at the last election and effectively clearing out any semblance of reasonableness from the mainstream of the Conservative Party. they need to find a home. And surely one of the main ways that they can find a home is by reclaiming a centre-right party of their own as a liberal democratic party with a small L, small d.
Thanks, Michael. A very lawyerly clarification there at the end. So, okay. Sorry, Michael, do we have any other questions here?
Well, I mean, just briefly, maybe to just pick up on the direction of conversation there. Somebody in the chat had noted the intention of holding a rejoin march next May, which is correct, isn't it? And is something that Cambridge for Europe is looking to support.
Yes, that will be on, I think, the 7th of May, which is a couple of days before Europe Day, which is on the Monday the 9th. So that'll be on Saturday the 7th of May. I think plans are still being made for, and exactly what the themes of that will be is still underway. It's still being discussed. But yeah, I think that's in most groups' calendar. So I think if probably worth keeping that free. Something will be organised then, and probably something very big. Looking at the situation, there might well be things beforehand, maybe not so focused on Brexit, maybe more on democracy and the rule of law. So I think we'll just have to see. I mean, I would suggest to anybody, if you are, certainly in Cambridge, become a member. If you'd like, our committee always needs more people, and the same goes for any committee of any of the pro-EU groups, the European movement groups around the country. We're all run by volunteers in our free time and time we can prize away from other things, and it just needs a campaign. I think the next few months and years will need all hands on decks, and I think they will need people to work together as well. I mean, you mentioned the in some cases liberal Tories or some of the ones I know they're former Tories at this stage, but I think there are people there who can probably be won back if the messaging is right, but I think we do need to just get out there and make ourselves visible again. I think that's one of the very important things, not just for our sakes, but also for the sake of the EU and for Ireland and other countries, so that not everyone in the UK agrees with this. I think a lot of people do already appreciate that. I'm seeing some of the comments about that, but I think it's not something to be taken for granted. News reports can be quite helpful that way.
I mean, if we had time for maybe a couple more questions for Michael, there were a couple of interesting points, I think, again, sort of broadly around some of those rule of law type issues. This was something Michael touched on earlier, but Gareth Williams had asked, would a codified constitution have helped us over the last 5 years? Help prevent us getting into some of the extreme situations that we seem to be getting into?
A dead good question. And of course, the answer, very lawyerly answer, is it depends on what that codified constitution said. You can have good codified constitutions, you can have bad ones. I think maybe the key point here is a more general one. I think the UK, for a very long time, has basically been run on the basis that we don't need too many constitutional rules because we're all good, decent chaps. And for as long as you live in a political culture where we're all good, decent chaps, maybe that is a sustainable position to adopt. The big lesson I think we've learned over the past however many years is that when a political force comes along that is not willing to play by the gentleman's club rules of the game, which simply, it's not just that it doesn't agree with the rules of the game or doesn't want to play by them, they want to sweep them away. They positively want to sweep away the way that business has been done for a very long time. It's better to have a system of checks and balances that actually work. From that point of view, yes, a written constitution, or at least a clearer set of constitutional parameters, could have really helped us. For example, many countries do say, if you're going to make a fundamental, gigantic change to the way the country works, you need a minimum majority, not just 52-48. That type of constitutional rule could have helped quite a lot. Many federalized systems will say, if you really want to completely fundamentally change the way the country works, you've got to have the buy-in of the constituent territories. Nobody gave a damn about Scotland and Northern Ireland in this whole process, and the fact that they had radically different views from England and Wales. So yes, of course, Gareth, a codified constitution could have helped if it was written in the right way. But for me, I think the point is that we've now learned our lesson. We should have learned our lesson. Relying on a system which is about decent chaps and gentlemen's rules and unwritten understandings has proven to be an incredibly dangerous game. I was always a bit of a skeptic about written constitutions, never that fussed about them, not against them, but never that fussed on them. Now I'm absolutely convinced that we need a fundamental restructuring of the way that the UK state operates and the basis on which it's formed. And that's one positive lesson from Brexit. I've bloody learned a lot and I'll never go back to the same naive complacency I think I had before. Is it okay, Michael, if I just make one point about sort of the rejoin issue? Because I think we need to be a little bit brutal with ourselves here as well. Rejoining the EU is not a prospect that we're going to see, not realistically, for really quite a while, for the very simple reason, so much damage has been done, and this is deliberate, Johnson set out to do this. So much damage has been done that we are basically viewed as a dangerous basket case across most of Europe, and they wouldn't let us back even if we came begging on our knees. Until we sort out our own fundamental problems and actually prove ourselves worthy of being back in the club, we will not get back in the club. And I think this does create a direct link with Gareth's question. How do we sort ourselves out? It's partly a matter of reconstituting our democracy, and that probably will require some major constitutional reforms. That's not to say that campaigning to rejoin and having marches and rallies isn't important for two main reasons. First of all, the obvious one, we need to keep ourselves motivated. This is all deeply depressing. It is very easy to retract into our own little lives and just close the curtains and the doors and say, I just don't have the energy for this. It's all too depressing and too miserable. We need to keep ourselves motivated. And that means getting together, talking about it, having an aspiration, having an aspiration to work towards. But equally, as Paul said several times, and I completely agree, we need to keep reminding the rest of Europe that the UK is not entirely a basket case, that actually a majority of the population do not support Boris Johnson, did not vote for his government, and do not support its policies. And there is still a huge number of people in the UK who are horrified by what's happening and want to do things differently. So while rejoin in itself might now be a longer term aspiration, I think we have very good reason to keep it as a focal point for a lot of what we discuss and talk about, albeit with a degree of realism that this is something we have to work for, both internally and externally.
Absolutely agree. I think that is basically, you described my position on this. We do need to keep the flag flying, even though we know that what we're seeking will perhaps not be achieved for many years, if not decades, really. Actually, do you have time for a couple more quick questions? Michael, do you?
Yeah, sure.
I forgot to ask, and you had to your hard deadline. We got one from Jennifer Zirk and a related one from Michael Clegg. They're kind of touching on kind of similar areas, so I think it's best done together. So Jennifer's question is: Mr. Raab actually serious about ditching the Human Rights Act? He sounds a bit half-hearted. He's talking about overhauling the Human Rights Act rather than simply repealing it. What changes does he actually want to see? And a question which is kind of similar relation to that is from Michael, who says, what is the Johnsonian political project? If its ideological underpinnings aren't straightforward, free market, libertarian, what are they? Is it simply Putin-esque gangsterism? So kind of two questions, which about what is the motivation fueling the government's behavior?
Yeah. In response to Jennifer's question, I'm afraid I'm going to have to do my expert opt-out. I'm not a human rights lawyer. I'm not an ECHR lawyer, so I'm afraid I just don't feel qualified to answer the question properly. And given that one of the main messages I've tried to get across over the past 6-7 years is listen to experts, don't listen to people pretending to be experts, I don't want to fall into that trap myself. I just don't know enough about it. If anybody here knows more about it than I do, it would be dead interesting to hear. All I can say is it's part of the same project. It has smacks of all of the same tactics and antics. And we have every reason to be fearful of a government that has set itself the goal of fundamentally rewriting the basic protections that stand between the citizen and the abuse of state power. Governments rarely want to change the system of human rights in favor of the citizen and in order to impose greater checks on their own potential to abuse power. And this government is certainly very far from an exception to that general rule, quite the opposite. In terms of Michael's question, I mean, God, if it is one of the key things that I suspect keeps many of us awake at night, wondering why are they doing this? What is the bloody point of it all? I think we should probably accept that this is an unholy alliance, and there are probably lots of competing parts of this coalition of interest which think they're going to get something out of this state of chaos and upheaval, out of this hard Brexit and the problems here and the problems there. I've got no doubt that there's a degree of gangsterism. I've got no doubt that there's a lot of ideological fixation. I'm sure there are lots of right-wing weirdos who think that the UK just needs to be thrown into turmoil. They sort of throw the chessboard up and see where the pieces land. As for Johnson himself, I just think he's a deranged, narcissistic psychopath. I can't think of any other explanation for the behavior of a man which is so obnoxious and so self-serving and so indifferent to the suffering of others. And I'm going to say something which is not about Brexit at all, contrary to my experts only thing I just said. Sorry, this is a man who's presided over the unnecessary deaths of tens of thousands of people and still walks around with a smirk on his face, painting his silly little pictures on holiday, rather than turn up to Parliament to face a critical report from MPs about his responsibility for policies which have unnecessarily killed tens of thousands of people. I don't really care what his motivations are in his mind. To me, he is a deranged, narcissistic psychopath who is unfit for public office. But in answer to Michael's question, I'm sure it's an unholy alliance. And if you ask different constituencies of the Leave movement, you'll get very different answers. What we can be sure of is that a very large number of people who voted Leave or supported Leave are now very disappointed because they are not getting what they were promised. And in fact, many of them are getting something very, very different from what they were promised. I think that comes back to what I said before. How does Johnson make Brexit feel like a success to all of these people who haven't been showered with the delights and the wonders of paradise after withdrawal? By stirring up hatred and division, by driving a wedge between the UK and the EU so that Brexit feels natural and inevitable and something that had to happen because we had to get away from these horrible foreigners.
Yeah, I mean, from I guess your perspective and my perspective, especially and a lot of people's, is that as the UK, Boris Johnson's trying to get the UK as far away from the EU as possible. The Northern Ireland is literally stuck in the middle, and that's, and if you're in that situation, it could get torn apart. And he doesn't seem to care. Johnson's project is Johnson.
Yeah.
So that's
exactly.
Yeah. Anyway, have you have any more questions, or shall we call it a night there? Do you think, Michael?
I wonder if we should call it a night, Paul. But I wonder if it's worth saying verbally what you've just put into the chat about our next event.
Yeah, I was just going to say our next event, well, the very next event is this Saturday. We have a stall in Market Square, Cambridge. If I can work out how to use copy and paste. I've just added it to the chat, a link to our website, and that's between 12 and 4, and we will have a stall there. We'll be giving out leaflets, talking to people. We'll have one of our Brexitometers asking, how do you think Brexit's going, or sorry, is Brexit working on various issues? I think we expect what the result will be. But it's, yeah, if you could join us, that'd be great. If you can spare an hour or two to volunteer, just send us an email and let us know when. That would be brilliant. The next event we have, which is going to be on the 16th of November, where it's Professor Andy Jordan from the University of East Anglia will be joining us to discuss environmental policy in the UK and the EU after Brexit. So I think that's very interesting, another subject which we'll be hearing a lot of over the next few weeks. And one where the Johnson government's behaviour has been quite inconsistent, I think, to put it mildly, over the last year and a half. So I'll just press on that, and yeah, that's in the chat now there again. So if you can join that would be brilliant. We'll be, of course, having other events and activities and campaigns over the next coming months and years. So please, yeah, get involved. It'd be great to see you all there. I'll finish by thanking Michael Dougan for his for a great and very interesting talk. I feel we could gone on for quite a lot longer, so maybe we'll have to have you back in a few months and discuss how it all went right or wrong, or somewhere in between, which is probably more likely. And I'd like to thank Michael Clegg, my colleague, for helping with managing the questions here. And finally, I'd like to thank all you guys in the audience for joining us tonight, for staying with us, for lots of interesting comments and questions. And yeah, we hope to see you again at an event in the very near future. Thank you.